So welcome everyone to LG Lesson 4, and in this one I'll be demonstrating how I can start off with brute force and not really knowing anything from any point, any question, any answer choice in a particular game, and use that to gain insights and deductions that I may have skipped over or missed in the earlier initial setup. So again, that's in a nutshell the role of brute force. You use it to answer questions when you have nothing else, but as you are using it, it is up to you, and it is highly advisable that you pick up on insights and deductions along the way. Let's get started here. So as for what the lesson itself contains, most of you already know the value of brute forcing LG. It's largely what makes this section the easiest to reliably minus zero. But as I just mentioned, I've been getting a lot of questions recently. Hey James, can we really get away with purely brute forcing answers in 35 minutes? And the short answer is probably not. It is not impossible, but broadly speaking, it's neither feasible nor recommended. As for a slightly longer answer, brute force should be engaged as just one of several tools at your disposal when it comes to LG. I think the healthiest way to look at brute force, or purely brute force approach, is to see it as an ultimate fallback. Your goal is going to be to try to learn tricks and shortcuts and deductions as you answer questions. But when all else fails and you're just out of ideas or you just missed something, the table of power plus brute force, those two things will always be there to bail you out. But more than the fallback utility, what I hope to demonstrate today is that within the first few attempts of brute forcing just the first few questions, so many important rule interactions will make themselves known just by you brute forcing and applying the rules. Learn to pick up on these inferences and use them to your advantage on future answer choices and on future questions. That's really the key. So to demonstrate the fallback utility plus the interesting rule interaction thing that I just mentioned, I will be doing a game that is highly susceptible to deduction. But I'll just brute force almost everything as though I failed to pick up on most such insights along the way. I will, however, do stuff like, hey, we just saw interaction X from testing answer choice B, we may as well use that knowledge here for answer choice C. I will take shortcuts like that within the same question, but I will, as much as possible, pretend like we don't remember or didn't pick up on deductions and inferences from previous questions. So the game specifically that we'll be doing is from Prep Test 24, Section 4, questions 18 through 23. This is an older game, which you have likely seen before because it's a very popular one to teach. And being as old as it is, it's from a generation of games that were definitely designed to be done with deductions. In many ways, I believe it's one of the worst possible ones to brute force. It's particularly susceptible to a high number of deductions, and it takes care the deductive stuff. If you really spin it out at the beginning and spend some time, it really does give you a leg up on the way the passage, or excuse me, not the passage, the game is structured. I believe it's also no coincidence that most of the answer choices turn out to be E, because I think they're trying to punish you for brute forcing it. But I think because of that difficulty, there is no better example to show the utility of brute force in terms of it being able to save you from a zero knowledge situation when the expectation is that you would have quite a bit of knowledge going to a question. I do want to emphasize, though, that again, a purely brute force approach is not my recommended tactic. The most efficient approach to LG engages any deductions that you find obvious from the initial setup phase, so just kind of looking at the intro paragraph and the rules, in addition to any deductions that you find within the process of answering questions, and any smart eliminations you can make based on rules or work done for previous questions without even actually having to try these answer choices. And only then brute forcing answers when you've tried everything else and you can't get to one single correct answer. So again, to reiterate, I am demonstrating a nearly pure brute force approach only to show that even when you are missing what others would consider necessary deductions, you can still get answers. So this is just to show you that there is always hope. No matter how desperate you are, even if you are absolutely certain that you're missing insights, that you're supposed to have picked up on something that you have picked up, brute force is still going to be there. It can still get you to the right answer with a reasonable amount of effort. It's going to look terrible here because I'll have to explain step by step what I'm doing because I'm brute forcing things. But this is one of those many things in life where it is much faster and easier to actually do brute force than to explain it to somebody else, even people who presumably actually know how brute force generally works. Because I do believe I'm kind of preaching to the choir here for the most part. But yeah, it's not going to be very fun for you guys to watch, unfortunately. But that's how it's going to be. But yeah, this is feasible. You can do questions that you kind of need deductions for, need in quotation marks. That you kind of need deductions or insights for. But even if you don't have them, you can still get them correct in a reasonable amount of time. And so, as we always do, just going to start with the setup and in particular the intro paragraph. And so, just kind of reading through it, it seems that we have 9 entities to work with, split into 3 different groups with 3 entities each. So we get a group called antibiotics, and those consist of F, G, and H. We also get 3 dietary regimens, which consist of M, N, and O. And finally, we get 3 physical therapies, which are U, V, and W. And even though up to this point I didn't really know what we were doing with these, it appears that this is going to be a purely in and out game by the time I get to kind of the end of the intro paragraph here. We are told that we are going to select exactly 5 out of the 9. Nice, that's always helpful. And upon finishing the intro paragraph, I see that we are not going to order or separate the entities into groups besides the labels that the intro paragraph has already given them. We're not going to do anything further with them besides picking purely just 5 out of the 9. There's a chance that there's something tucked into the rules, but as of this intro paragraph, that's all that we are going to be doing. And so in terms of a diagram, I'm going to make our diagram just a set of 5 blanks, and we'll use vertical lines to delineate differences between antibiotics, dietary regimens, and physical therapies as needed. Again, I don't actually know when and how the separation is going to matter, but the fact that they have gone out of their way to tell us that these 3 classes of entities exist and have given them names, I'm just going to assume that there is going to be some measure of importance in terms of figuring out how many of each that we have. So this is what the diagram is going to look like. And there we go. Just going to be a set of 5 blanks, and I just kind of separated and singled out one space with the vertical dividers in the middle there. Because I kind of remember doing this game back in the day, but that's just arbitrary. I will use vertical lines like that to delineate the different groups depending on whether or not a question actually requires it or not. And again, my suspicion is that it will. And in terms of a rule 0, the only rule 0 I'd consider in this intro paragraph is that exactly 5 out of the 9 thing, but that happens to be hard-coded into our diagram, which only has 5 blanks in it. So I don't feel the need to list a separate rule 0. But yeah, because our diagram has it, that is something that I'm always going to be thinking about, and I will think about it first as I'm assessing rules. We'll start with rule 0, which is that we need to pick 5 out of the 9. That's going to be the baseline, the foundation for basically everything else that I do. And now onto the rules, starting with rule 1. This one tells us that there's a maximum of 2 out of the antibiotic FGH group will be selected to show up in our group of 5. So max 2 antibiotics. Rule 2. This one tells us something very interesting. Exactly 1 out of the dietary regimen group, that's MNO, exactly 1 dietary regimen is selected. This should stand out to you as an extremely limiting rule because it's not up to 1. Or it's not like rule number 2 or rule number 1 where there's a maximum of 2. Rule number 2 is exactly 1, no more, no less. So that's always going to be very handy for us. So there's always going to be exactly one slot among our 5 given to dietary regimens. That's going to prove fairly helpful in the future. Rules 3 through 5 are all fairly standard formal logic with contrapositives. I'm just going to kind of throw them up here in a chunk, pause, and write this down if you need to, but I'm going to assume that most of you kind of know how to do this, at least at a basic level. And finally, there's Rule 6. One thing that I do want to note about Rule 6 and kind of train you guys to have some sensitivity to is that Rule 6 is a little different from Rule 5 in that the presence of V has a huge impact. There's only 5 slots total, right? But if one of those slots is taken up by V, we know that 2 more of the remaining slots are taken up by H and M. Not only that, M is one of our dietary regimens, so it takes that 1 dietary regimen spot. H is a little bit less important because we don't really know exactly how many antibiotics that we're going to have, if it's alone or if it has other stuff. So there's more flexibility there, but still, that's something that I want you to take a note of. As for any further deductions, yes, I am aware that they exist and they are exceedingly powerful for this specific game. Particularly rules 1 and 2, when put together, yield what I believe most people in the business call a numerical distribution, where there's really, based on the numbers of stuff that we have available, there's really only 2 basic breakdowns to do, and then you fill out a bunch of pictures. I think it turns into, if I recall correctly, 4 separate pictures that are pretty much completely filled in. So there's actually no variability in this game when it comes down to it. Yes, I'm aware that they exist, but no, I'm not going to be using any of those here. I'm not doing that because it's not that I want to demonstrate that you shouldn't use them if you manage to see them. But again, the whole point of today is to be demonstrating the power of a pure brute force approach. That's what I'm here to do today. And this also goes for the 2 rule insights that I just gave you as I was listing the rules. Excuse me. So rule number 2, being as limiting and helpful as it is. Same thing with rule number 6, that if V shows up, all of a sudden 3 out of our 5 slots, so 60% of our game is basically done whenever V shows up. Yeah, those are the kinds of things that I do want you guys to become sensitive to. But just for the purposes of demonstrating the power of brute force today, even if you are missing things that the game kind of expects you to have picked up at a certain level, brute force still gives you a way forward. You can still find a way to figure out those things that you may not be able to get without assistance up front at this stage. So yeah, that's the point today. So bear with me. There's going to be a certain point that I'm sure that all of you are going to be internally screaming at me, but James, don't you remember? James, don't you remember? Yeah, I do, but remember, it's the point of demonstration, so we're kind of going to do every question from scratch. Alright, so let's get right into it. We have a long lesson today anyway. So we'll start with question number 18, the standard rule checker. And so just to make sure, it doesn't give us like half of the diagram or anything. It's literally they're asking us for what can be a full slate of 5 treatments, so nothing special here. So starting as we always do with rule number 1 on these things, just going to look at 1. We eliminate A because it uses more than 2 of the antibiotic FGH group. So that gets rid of A and it looks like nothing else. Rule 2 is a 2 for 1. It eliminates both B and C because each of those use more than one dietary regimen, and of course dietary regimens are the M, N, and O group. Rule 3 unfortunately comes up as empty. That's got nothing in it. So yeah, nothing is eliminated by that. Rule 4 does eliminate something, but it's nothing new because we've already got rid of C because of other reasons, so this one is also kind of a bust. Rule 5 is pretty handy. It allows us to eliminate answer choice D. And even though we've eliminated A, B, C, and D at this point, I'm just going to check Rule 6 because this is the first question of the game and I've done no deductive work. I just want to make sure that I've covered all my bases. Rule 6, unfortunately, does not also tell us anything new because we've already eliminated B for other reasons. So I will be just selecting answer choice E. I think, like most rule checkers, you can just be satisfied with picking the one answer that hasn't eliminated anything, but if you are nervous, you can just do a quick check of what E says against all the other rules, and you can confirm that it works. I won't do it here, you can do it for yourselves if you really want to, but it works. Alright, now the first sort of real question number 19. In terms of the antibiotics and the physical therapies selected, which of the following could be true? That's how I see this question. And so could be true questions being kind of the easiest type of question to do. You just plug it in and see if it works, then you choose it, and if it doesn't, you just move on to the next one. So just going to start with option A here, FGHW. I am going to eliminate this immediately based on rule number 1 because if we just went down our list of rules to check, we would see that immediately this doesn't work because it uses all 3 antibiotics. So just going to get rid of it here. The next one down the list, though, B, which lists out FGUV, is not quite as obviously eliminable here. So let's take a closer look at it. So the first thing I am going to do is try to incorporate the information from the choice FGUV directly into the diagram that we have. So it's going to look something like this. It's going to be FG and then a vertical line separating it out just to show that we have our 2 antibiotics, and because of rule 1, that's the maximum that we're allowed, so that's it. That's our antibiotics that show up, and no more, no less. The second thing that I'm going to have is the UV. And even though there are 3 physical therapies that are possible, I'm just going to say the UV are going to be the only 2 because I'm also keeping in mind rule number 2, which tells us that exactly 1 dietary regimen has to show up, and the dietary regimen has not been accounted for yet by FGUV. So yeah, that's what our picture looks like. So again, we're not really doing anything other than keeping rules 1 and 2 in mind as we're doing things like that. So I don't really know what to put into the dietary regimen slot to finish it out. So and again, I would like to finish it out because that's how we're going to know that this works. But to do that, the easiest way to move forward is just to check rule by rule just to see if it demands that we do anything or if there's something else wrong with the picture. So rule number 1 seems fine. We don't need to have this. This picture doesn't force us to have a third antibiotic. It seems fine. Rule number 2. This also seems fine because we do have room for the 1 single dietary regimen, but we're just keyed into the potential issue of which diet we need to select to throw in. That may matter at this point. Rule 3. This is kind of the first change that we have to our picture. This would require us to add O as our dietary regimen. So because it's mandated by the answer choice, I'm just going to kind of throw that in red here as if it came from the answer choice. So we would end up with FG, UV, followed by O, and that would fill things out. And again, this is because we're just following the rules from beginning to end, not really skipping forward. And at this point in the rules list that we've gotten, this is the only thing that is mandated. Rule 4 seems fine because even though we have F, we don't have W, so that's allowed. Rule 5 also seems fine because this tells us that G can't be around if both N and U are around. We do have G, but we are missing N even though we have U, so Rule 5 is still safe. Rule 6, though, presents a problem. Rule 3, as you recall, required us to choose O as our one single dietary regimen thanks to the presence of F. So Rule 3 forced us to put O in that last clear spot. But Rule 6 similarly requires us to choose M as our one dietary regimen thanks to the presence of V, and V again was forced onto us by the answer choice itself. So Rule 6 requires us to have M in that one diet slot. Rule 3 requires us to have O in that one diet. To make matters worse, Rule 6 also requires us to use H, which we simply do not have room for, because again, Rule 3 required us to put in O in that last spot. We don't have room to put anything else. And honestly, even if Rule 3 and Rule 6 didn't use up the dietary slot, we'd still be out of room for where to put H, because H already would be, that we'd have FGH, and that's not allowed. That's violation rule number 1. Whatever the case may be, it just doesn't work. Too many things are going wrong here. So all of what I just said represents an unresolvable contradiction amongst several rules, so we end up eliminating B. So for the same question, moving on to answer choice C, which proposes the use of F, U, V, and W. And so again, pretending like we don't really have any insights about the game and we don't really know which rules matter and where to look first, and we're just going to be going in the rules from 1 to 6 in order, not really skipping around to our advantage. First thing I'd do is just throw the option C, F, U, V, W, into our diagram. This is what I'd get. F on its own as the one antibiotic, and I know that it's only going to be one and going to be alone because we're using all 3 physical therapies, U, V, and W. If we combine that with our one dietary regimen that is mandated, that does force us to use only one antibiotic. So again, pretending like we don't have any insights and we don't have any shortcuts, starting with rule number 1, seems fine. We are only using one antibiotic, we're not using 3 of them, so that's good. Rule 2 also seems fine. Of course, we don't know yet what we have to put in there, if anything, but it does appear that we have room for it, room to satisfy Rule 2 at least, so I'm going to say this seems fine. Rule 3, like last time in B, it does require us to select O as our dietary regimen because if O is not prescribed, F cannot be prescribed, but we happen to have F here, so we do. That does mean that we are forced to use O. So this is what our updated picture would look like. F, U, V, W, and then O as our single dietary regimen. We'll just continue going down the list of rules with this in mind and see if we run into anything. We run into something we do right when it comes to Rule 4. This immediately eliminates C. W makes us unable to use F, but this answer has both W and F. So kudos to you if you saw this possibility and immediately the first thing you thought of was rule number 4 and the W and F non-combination. That's something that definitely could have done, but here I am to show you that as long as you're being methodical and you're just moving from beginning to end when it comes to the rules, you will find out the things that you may have missed or the things that you are not quite good at picking up, or whatever the case may be. Maybe if you're under pressure, this is the first kind of thing that goes for you, finding these inferences, being able to skip around the rules. But again, I'm just here to show you that even when you have the brain-dead approach that I do on a question, you have no insights, you're not looking for insights, you're not even looking at the rules out of order to your advantage. Because if I just looked at the rules immediately and skipped down to rule 4, I could have just saved all this talking and just been done with it, right? But again, the point is to show you that just starting from beginning to end, you will eventually run into the thing that you need to find out, so long as you are properly understanding the rules and so long as you are applying them. So now on the same question, that pushes us into answer choice D, with GUVW being what's used. So again, the first order of business is to take the information from the answer choice and just plug it into our diagram, see what we get. So kind of similarly to last time, we have G by itself with UVW, all 3 physical therapies. And the 5th and final spot will have to be given to a single dietary regimen that is mandated by Rule 2. That's what our breakdown looks like. So starting with the list of rules, Rule 1 seems fine. Rule 2 seems fine. Again, we don't know who goes in there just yet, but we do have room for that one dietary regimen, so I'm going to say that this seems fine as of right now. Rule 3 also seems fine. If O is not prescribed, F cannot be prescribed, but this time we don't even have F in our picture, and we don't really even have room to put it in there, so seems good. Very similar thing for rule number 4. We don't have F, so we don't even need to worry about W disqualifying it, so yeah, it's all good. Rule 5 also seems fine. G cannot be prescribed, both N and U are prescribed. Again, we have G and we do have a U, but we do not have to have an N. We could have an N if we decide to throw it in there, but I don't think there's any reason for us to. So yeah, seems fine for the time being. Rule 6, though, does present a problem for us. Using V, according to rule number 6, requires us to also use both H and M. So even though we can easily throw an M as our one sole single dietary option, there isn't room to also add an H. So at this point we eliminate D because Rule 6 doesn't allow us to move forward. And that of course leaves us with E at this point for this question: H, U, V, and W. I do want to note here that being so methodical as we have been with A through D, that does mean that I could probably just pick E without even checking it, but for the sake of instruction, I'll still confirm that it works today, despite how much work I think it's going to end up being. So again, this is what our answer choice inserted into a blank diagram looks like. We start off with H. We don't really know much else about it other than the fact that we do have to use U, V, and W. That's in our answer choice. And so that does also only leave us with one option for a dietary regimen at the end. And so if we have a total of 5, this has to be the breakdown. 1 antibiotic, followed by all 3 physical therapies as mandated by the answer choice, and finally 1 single dietary regimen as mandated by Rule 2. And now running through the rules, Rule 1 seems fine. Rule 2 also seems fine. We don't know which dietary regimen there is, but we do have a space for it, whatever it is, so that seems fine so far. Rule 3 also seems fine. If O is not prescribed, F cannot be prescribed. Neither O nor F are anywhere to be seen yet, so this doesn't really seem to be a problem. Rule 4 also seems fine. This is a W and F problem. We do see a W, but we don't see an F, and we really don't have room for it either, because H is taking the only antibiotic slot that we have for this situation. All good. Rule 5 is also fine. G cannot be prescribed both N and U. G is not even on the board, so that's fine. So finally, Rule 6 does seem okay as well. It turns out if we have a V in our picture, which we do, we need to use both H and M. Already got the H taken care of, the answer choice did that itself. And so now we require the M, and M, we do have room for it because M is a dietary regimen. And so we can just throw that in there. And it seems to work, yeah. It checks out against all the rules. Feel free to pause and check again if you want, but we've been methodical enough that I feel confident that we can just pick it. So as written on the page, number 20 says, if O is prescribed for a given case, which one of the following is a pair of treatments, both of which must also be prescribed for that case. I'm just going to translate it as, if O shows up, what other 2 must show up along with it, so it's a must-be-true question. So I'd like to note that although this is a must-be-true question, and the table of power does give us procedure, this also happens to be a must-be-true question that gives us something to plug in. So I've highlighted the letter O in blue there. That's just to highlight that the question stem itself has provided us some information to put into a diagram. As such, we should plug in what they give us and see if anything comes of it before moving to the table of power for some straight eliminations. So just kind of plugging the blue O into our diagram, that alone doesn't give us a whole lot. I'm not sure we know anything else about the numerical distribution of antibiotics and physical therapies. All we know is that the one diet we have is O, and that can yield some interesting deductions based on some of the other rules involving dietary regimens, but again, the idea is is kind of here in this demonstration to pretend like we're not the most deductive people out there, so just going to leave that be for the time being. So according to rule number 1, there's nothing immediately useful. All we know is that there's max 2 antibiotics, and that could describe any situation. Paired with this one dietary regimen, not a whole lot we can do. Rule 2 also doesn't really give us much to do with because it's already accounted for. All it tells us is that there's only one dietary regimen. We've got one. The best we can do is just say that that's the only one, but aside from that, no new data really. Rule 3 also doesn't provide us anything immediately useful. We just know that F is a possible antibiotic if we want to use it, but so it's eligible, but we don't know anything about the antibiotic group yet. Rule 4, similarly, nothing immediately useful. We don't know what the status of W or F is, so it doesn't really give us anything to draw out specifically. Similarly, Rule 5, nothing particularly useful. G can't be prescribed if both N and U are prescribed. At the very least, I mean, we know that N can't show up anyway because O is taking up the one slot that N could possibly have gone into. So, yeah, I mean, all that tells us that G can never be disqualified because it's impossible for us to have both N and U if we're using O. But again, nothing that I can really throw in there. I'd like to say the same thing for rule number 6, nothing immediately useful, but there is something that does come of it. We do know we can't use V because our one dietary regimen spot is already taken by O, and V would require M to be there instead. So again, because O is taking up the one dietary regimen spot, and V requires M to be in that spot instead of O, we know that in this scenario, we cannot use V. Unfortunately for myself and for you, fellow viewers, I am going to pretend like I did not see this, because working without this kind of inference is actually what a lot of you specifically asked me about, because you guys aren't just asking, because most of you know that brute force isn't efficient, but I think what you guys, at least those of you who have reached out to me by email, have asked me, is something along the lines of this, where there's a deduction when you go back and look at it after the fact, when you're kind of not in the middle of doing the game, you're a little calmed down, you've checked your answers, you've already done a blind review, that sort of thing. In those scenarios, you go back and look like, there's a key deduction or inference I should have made, but I consistently kind of missed this under pressure. And you're looking for ways to either catch the deduction better, which you will get from other sources that like to teach you how to actually do deductions better. So, Seven Sage, Demon, all those other places that are teaching you stuff, feel free to learn the techniques from them, because I'm not going to bother to teach you. So there's one method of just learning not to miss the deductions. The other thing that most people are actually interested in talking to me about is, rather than trying to find the deductions, in addition to doing that, what a lot of folks are doing is hedging their bets by trying to train themselves to learn how to get past the not having of the deduction. And that's kind of precisely what this plug and chug brute force demonstration is going to be about. So again, this is the thing about Rule 6 here. This is the kind of thing that I feel like a lot of you have asked me about. Okay, how do I detect this issue, or how do I get around it if I haven't detected it as an issue? That's what we're about to do here today. So, having thus pretended, it is time for us to go hit the table of power when it comes to these things. I do want to point out that there is one other thing we could do to make things a bit more efficient. If you just look at the answer choices here, U appears in 3 of the 5 choices, so determining if U is required, if that's a must be true, that can help us a lot, but again, it's not the absolutely most essential thing to look for. Again, for like the 80th time, the whole point of this demonstration is to show what can be done with just the rules and minimal deductive shortcuts. So in the event that any of you are, as I'm going along, afraid that you haven't picked up on any of the things that I've picked up, again, don't worry. Most of the methodology that we'll do from here to the end of the video will be presuming that you have missed all of those important little tidbits along the way. How can you still get questions, right? That's what we're here to show you. So starting right with answer choice A. Given that this is a must-be-true question, we're going to take the answer choice, which here suggests that F and M are the 2 that must appear alongside of O. We're asking ourselves, can we get away with not using both of these at the same time? So again, kind of trying to throw that into our picture here, if we have just the singular letter O from the question stem, based on Rule 0 and Rule 1, we can have the following breakdowns. We can either have 2 antibiotics and 2 physical therapies to round out the mandated 5 that we have to have total, based on Rule 0. That can be a breakdown. Or we move to having only 1 antibiotic and 3 physical therapies, along with our mandated minimum, or exactly 1 of the dietary regimens, the slot which is already taken by O. So yeah, those are generally the 2 possibilities. So the third numerical possibility here with 0 antibiotics and 3 physical regimens, that does not work. So again, Rule 2 has already told us that we can only use exactly 1 dietary regimen, so there's no flexibility there. And if we don't use any antibiotics, all we are left with a maximum of 3 physical therapies to round this out. So again, without using any antibiotics, so if we have 0 antibiotics and 3 physical therapies, without using any antibiotics, we can't fill the mandated 5 slots that foundationally is what the game itself requires. So just to denote that this possibility is no longer on the table, I'm just going to cross it off strike through style right here. And so not only having the 2 possibilities, 2 antibiotics and 2 physical therapies, or 1 antibiotic and 3 physical therapies, I'm going to try the second one that I just mentioned. Because if we can get something to work that doesn't use both F and M, we win. And because of the way the second possibility is set up, there's going to be a little bit less guesswork for me. So in terms of filling out the rest of the diagram that we have from the 1 antibiotic and 3 physical therapy option, we already can't use M from the answer choice because we are already using O in that one spot. I'm just going to see if we can get away with using G or H, since we're avoiding F if possible, given what we're trying to do, to close this out. So it would look something like this. We'd have our O as our 1 dietary regimen, G is our 1 single antibiotic, and then U, V, and W would close out the 3 physical therapies, getting us to 5 treatments total. Checking this against the rules, rule number 1 seems fine. Rule number 2 also seems fine. Rule number 3 is also similarly fine. We do have an O, but we're not using F. Doesn't really seem to matter here. Rule 4 also seems fine. If W is prescribed, we don't have an F, but again, we don't have an F. All good. Rule 5, that also seems fine to me. If G is prescribed, N and U cannot also be prescribed. We have a G, we have a U, but we don't have an N. We're all good. And finally, we do have a problem with rule number 6. Looking at it from the perspective of rule 6 now, it seems like our basic picture with our O, our unnamed antibiotic, followed by U, V, and W, that actually never seems to work according to rules 2 and rule 6 in combination. So rule 2, to refresh your memory, is the one about we must have exactly one dietary regimen prescribed. And because of rule 2 in this scenario, we know that we can never actually use the letter M, since we're already using O, and O is taking up the one spot that M, N, or O is allowed to take. But rule 6 tells us that V requires M. So when we look at it this way, V is always going to be a problem for question 20, since it requires M. But we can never use M because question 20 is already mandating that we use O. And again, O being one of the dietary regimens, by mandating the use of the entity O, it's actually excluding us from using any of the other dietary regimens, so M and N are both permanently gone. And with M permanently gone, that also means that V is permanently gone. So based on this, we can actually eliminate anything that uses V or M, which kills A, B, and D immediately. So just as a note, I'm going to kind of leave it there. I am aware that when you push the V is always going to be a problem for us inference even farther than this. But you can still make progress reasonably efficiently without it, and so I'm going to pretend like I didn't know that this can be pushed even farther than I have, so we're just going to keep going with C and E. So having thus eliminated A, B, and D fairly easily, just with testing the last possibility, moving on to C here. C suggests that we have to use N and U together, so again, can we avoid using both of these at the same time? A small strategy note here, we only have C and E left to look at this point, and both choices seem to include the letter U. So getting rid of C because of U would also mean getting rid of E because of U, leaving us nothing to choose. So what that tells us is that we are really only going to figure out here, in terms of analyzing C, is figuring out whether or not N works. Because again, if we end up getting rid of U, that would get rid of both C and E at the same time. So that won't help us distinguish between these two answer choices. So right now we're just going to see if we can get away with not using N here. So again, this is kind of quasi-analytical, so it's a little bit cheating, but I'm beginning to get quite sick of this game already. So we just know from our work on answer choice A, the only breakdown that works is this one. It's O as our one dietary regimen, followed by 2 antibiotics and 2 physical therapies. As the other one forcibly includes V, and as we saw, we can never use V because we can never use M. So again, this is the only breakdown that works. 1 dietary regimen, 2 antibiotics, and 2 physical therapies. Because the 1 antibiotic and 3 physical therapies variant turns out to forcibly include V, because that's the only way you can have 3 physical therapies, is to have U, V, and W all present. And again, V is an impossibility because M is an impossibility. And that's all thanks to Rule 6. So incidentally, that means V and M are not eligible to appear in this one either. As we saw, this is going to be a question. This is going to be something that is fairly common to everything that we're working with here because of the use of O and the impact that it has on Rule 6. So now that we've just talked about V and M not being eligible to appear in this one either, I'm going to fill in the physical therapies first, because not being able to use V there means that both U and W must show up there. So this is what that looks like. We have our 1 dietary regimen filled with O. We have 2 as of yet undetermined antibiotics, but the 2 physical therapies we know are going to be U and W. So now all we have left are the antibiotics. We just need to figure out what combination from our antibiotics, F, G, and H, can fit in there according to the rules. I do want to note here that if you are looking ahead at the rules and you know that you're already looking, you see W and you see Rule 4, that's great. That's probably the ideal way to do it. But again, to remain as consistent as I possibly can in terms of how do you do things when you don't have those insights, when you don't know which rules matter, you don't know where to skip ahead, and you just don't know what to do. Start with the first rule and just work your way down, and you will come across the information that you need in relatively short order. So as promised, starting with Rule 1, not really relevant. We're already only going to use 2 of them, so it's already been accounted for. Similarly, Rule 2 is already accounted for. We only have one dietary regimen or picture, and that's O, and that's actually given to us by the question stem. No guesswork there. Taken care of. Rule 3, all this tells us is that we might be able to use F, but Rule 4 tells us that we actually can't use F because W is present. But hey, that means out of the FGH antibiotics group, we are stuck using G and H only because F cannot be used. So in terms of diagramming, it would look a little something like this. And again, I just want to point out that if you saw this immediately from working with the question stem, or at least the answer choice here, and didn't need to go through rules 1 through 3 and were able to just skip right to rule 4 and do it, that is the right way to do it. That's how I recommend it. That's ultimately the goal of teaching. But again, this is just to demonstrate that even if you are missing those key insights, even if you don't realize what's important and you don't know how to skip around or you're just too scared to, sometimes that happens. Sometimes we work below our potential capacity. It happens all the time. In the event of that kind of lockdown situation, don't get locked down. Just start with rule number 1, move down the list of rules, and you will come across the thing that you have missed that you need not to have missed. It will be there. Continuing on with our rules analysis with rules 5 and 6, just to close it out. We do have a complete picture now, and Rule 5 does seem fine with it. G cannot be prescribed if both N and U are prescribed. N is nowhere to be found, so G is safe here. In terms of Rule 6, we don't even have a V on the board, so it doesn't matter if we're also lacking M. We do have an H, but that doesn't really matter either. So yeah, don't have V, so we don't really need to consider any of these other conditions. So we have just successfully avoided using N and U as a pair, so we eliminate C. That leaves us with only E so far that has survived elimination. So that does bring us to our final answer choice, which we already kind of know is correct, E, which alleges that U and W have to be used if O is used. I want to emphasize here that given the thoroughness of our work so far, there is actually no need to check this. One of the things that we discovered during our work on answer choice C was that the breakdown of having O as our one dietary regimen with 2 unspecified antibiotics and 2 unspecified physical therapies requires both U and W. So we'll always have the following breakdown: O with 2 unspecified antibiotics, followed by U and W. And again, in case you forgot why we need to have U and W, basically we found out that we could never have V whenever we have O. So the question stem that we're working with is always going to throw O into whatever picture we have, no matter what answer choice we're doing. We're always going to have an O. That means that we can never have the letter M. And according to rule number 6, if we can never have the letter M, we can also never have the letter V. And so if we can never have the letter V, that means we're going to be forced to use U and W. So yeah, long story short, select answer choice E. We actually could have skipped all the work that I did for answer choice C. If we just simply push the O, we can't use the letter V inference farther during our work for A, because again, remember, that's when we ran into the problem with using V. Just for the sake of ease of checking an answer choice more easily, I picked an option that forced the use of the entity V. And in doing so, we very quickly found out that V can never actually be used if we're going to use O. And the question says we're using O, so every single answer choice, we have to be using O. So any single answer choice that has V in it is never going to work. And so if we had pushed that analogy further and done a little bit more deductive work right there, we could have figured out that, oh, actually, it looks like we have to use U and W right then and there. But of course, though, this whole thing is what happens when we miss certain insights. That's fine. You just kind of keep pushing. Sure, it takes a little bit longer because you have to do a little bit more confirmation. But again, it's not beyond you. You will get the information that you need eventually. So finally, we are free of 20 and moving on to 21. If G shows up, what other 2 could show up? So this is a could be true question. So being a could be true question, we're just going to plug these in, and if we get one of them to work, that's our selection. So A suggests that if G shows up, we can use F and M alongside of it. So as always, the first thing we do is that we throw the information from our stem and our answer choice that we're testing directly into a diagram. So that gives us a diagram that looks like this. We have F and G taking up the 2 antibiotic slots, and we have to stop there because Rule 1 tells us max 2 antibiotics. Rule 2 tells us there's exactly 1 dietary regimen. M seems to be taking the place of that here. And then that leaves 2 empty spaces for physical therapies, and we need exactly 2 here because Rule 0 tells us that we're looking for 5 total treatments. So this is what our diagram would look like. So based on this basic diagram, without even trying to experiment with who can go where in terms of the physical therapies, Rule 1 is already accounted for. Similarly, Rule 2 is accounted for. All that tells us that we need to have exactly 1 dietary regimen, and we have exactly 1 here in our diagram. So Rule 2 on its face, without combinations with anything else, seems to have been taken care of. Rule 3, though, presents us with a problem. If we use M as our sole dietary regimen, we can't use O, which according to Rule 3 means that if we're not using O, we also cannot use F. So this is a problem. Again, our answer choice itself prevents us from using O, but not using O prevents us from using F, which is another thing that appears in our answer choice. So this is unresolvable. And interestingly, any answer choice that pairs F with the letters M or N is by default wrong because of rules 2 and 3, as we discovered here. Rule 2, again, is the one that tells us that we can only use one dietary regimen. And if we have F as an antibiotic, we know that the dietary regimen that it needs is the letter O. So if we have anything other than the letter O showing up alongside the letter F in any of these choices, that can't be kosher. So that handily for us eliminates both answer choices A and B. So now that pushes us into testing answer choice C, we're going to see if we can use both letters N and V here. So again, as we always do, we insert the information from our question stem and the answer choice that we are testing directly into our diagram as the table of power tells us, and we are going to see how to finish this out. So we've got N as our sole dietary regimen. We do have G as a antibiotic, but we don't know, and we have V representing at least one of the physical therapies, but we don't really know what the rest of the breakdown for sure looks like. How are we going to reach the 5 treatments that are mandated by Rule 0? Well, it seems like there's a number of ways we can do that. So, as I was just discussing, we do need 2 more treatments. We've got 3 here, but we need 2 more to reach the mandated 5. And of these 2 additional treatments that we need to reach 5, only one of those additional 2 can be an antibiotic, and that's according to rule number 1. We can only have a maximum of 2 antibiotics. We're already using one of them in the form of G, so we can only add 1 more of them total, maximum, to kind of pad out. So really that leaves me with 2 numerical possibilities. Let's start with having no more antibiotics and having 2 more physical therapies on top of it, and that would look like something like this, right? The second numerical possibility is having 1 more antibiotic, and then that would require us to have only 1 more physical therapy, so that would look something like this. Again, I just want to note here that those of you who are familiar with this game or are just better at seeing numerical distributions, you would have known this kind of information without any sort of reliance on the rules on this particular question and this particular answer choice. It would be a much smoother process, and that's kind of the point. That is something that is helpful and something you should aim to learn how to do whenever possible. However, again, the whole point of today is you can still get all the information that you need in a relatively straightforward fashion, so long as you don't panic and you just keep moving, start with rule number 1 and just keep kind of plowing through the situation. Use the information that you have, plug it into the diagram, and when it leaves you short, ask the questions that I asked. What do we have left? What do we need to do to reach some of the fundamental requirements of what a working diagram is? Well, the first thing I start with is we have 3 letters here, how do we reach the mandated 5 that we need? How many more things can we work with? Well, we can work with up to a maximum of 1 more antibiotic. That's the one that has a limit. The physical therapies don't seem to have a limit, so looking at that leaves we can either add 0 more antibiotics or 1 more antibiotic, and that has the following consequences. There's a way to get to all this stuff just by orderly application of thought. So I am going to start with the 0 antibiotics and 2 physical therapies, additional antibiotics and 2 additional physical therapies breakdown, simply because, again, I like the certainty. There is no guesswork left in it. And why is that? That is because there are only 3 physical therapies to begin with. So if we end up using all 3, as our diagram here suggests, then what we get is this. We have N as our sole dietary regimen, G is our sole antibiotic, and then V, U, and W, because we have 3 physical therapies, so we got to use them all. So UW or UVW, all 3 of them show up. Now that we've got a complete picture, we just run through all the rules here. And again, kudos to you if you know which rule already matters and can skip right to it and eliminate based on that. But again, in case you are missing all these insights, just start with rule number 1, work your way down the list as quickly as you can. So rule number 1, already taken care of. We only have 1 antibiotic, so that fits into the maximum of 2. So this is all good. Rule number 2, again, already accounted for. We have exactly 1 dietary regimen. It's N, that's it. So this is all good. Rule 3 doesn't really even matter here. We can't work with O or F. We've already filled out a picture and there's no room for them, so we get to ignore this one. Rule 4 also doesn't matter. We do have W, but we don't have room for F anywhere in our picture, so it doesn't really matter. Rule 5, though, does present a problem. The question itself forces us to use G, and the answer choice that we're testing forces us to use N. But the breakdown we were testing, the one that has 0 additional antibiotics and 2 additional physical therapies, in that breakdown we are also forced to use U. that presents us an unresolved contradiction because, again, the question forces us to use G, the answer choice forces us to use N, and the breakdown itself forces us to use U, and Rule 5 tells us that G can't show up if both N and U are present, and all three are present, so this breakdown is no good. So moving on to the other breakdown, again I want to remind you guys that we just got done testing the following highlighted breakdown. That was 0 more antibiotics and 2 more physical therapies. That breakdown we have just discovered is not physically possible. So again, just for clarity's sake, I'm just going to give it the old strike through, and I will again move on by testing the only other possibility that we have, which is having 1 more antibiotic on top of what we already have, and 1 more physical therapy on top of what we already have. And that breakdown again looks like this. So moving on to that possibility, again, I've just kind of replicated it here so that it's more in line with the rules work that we're going to do shortly on it. And so on the previous slide, we just got done seeing how the presence of G, which is demanded by the question itself, the presence of N, demanded by answer choice C, means that we do need to avoid using U thanks to Rule 5. The only way to do that is to use W instead of U in the remaining physical therapy slot, which of course looks something like this. N is going to be from our answer choice, and it is the single dietary regimen we have. G from our question stem is going to be 1 of our 2 antibiotics. And finally, V and W are our 2 physical therapies. And again, in case you're confused, we have to use W here because we just figured out from the last slide that we do need to avoid using U, because G is required by question 21, N is required by the answer choice. And so if we want any chance of satisfying rule number 5, we do have to avoid using U at all costs. So having done that, as usual, we start with rule number 1, just work our way down the list. Rule number 1, it's fine. We're not using more than 2 antibiotics. It's already counted. Rule 2 also accounted for. We have exactly 1 dietary regimen. It's N. We're done. Rule 3, it's not exactly quite set in stone, but we know that since we cannot use O, according to Rule 3, that we can't use O again because we're already using N, and R2 tells us that we can only use 1 among the dietary M and O group. That we can't use F either, and that's because of Rule 3. If we're not using O, we're not using F. That leaves only H to fill the remaining antibiotic slot. So again, F, G, and H are the 3 antibiotics. We just figured out that because we can't use O, we can't use F. So that means that our last remaining candidate is H here. And of course, this is what our now complete diagram looks like. And we will just continue moving down the rules here. Rule number 4, we're all good there. W is prescribed, but we don't have F, so we're all good. Rule 5 is already accounted for. If G cannot be prescribed for both N and U are prescribed, again, we are very careful to avoid U, so you don't have to even worry about this one. Rule 6. This is kind of a familiar situation. Rule 6, though, does present us a problem. And again, kudos to you if you already saw this coming a long ways back, whenever you saw that we are using V from the answer choice, and then we are also using N as our 1 dietary regimen. But again, that is the way you're supposed to see it. That is the way I would advise you to train yourself to see it. But this, again, is to demonstrate somewhat laboriously that we still can reach these insights without taking too much time. So to elaborate, V requires both H and M, but it turns out using N excludes both M and O thanks to rule number 2. So again, N is a dietary regimen. Anytime we use any single dietary regimen, that excludes the other 2 dietary regimens from showing up because rule 2 tells us that we are using exactly one of those 3 at all times. So in fact, looking at it now, since Rule 2 allows us to only use 1 diet, any answer choice that pairs V with a diet other than M is acceptable. So this is very similar to what we saw in the previous question about F and O. F is an antibiotic that required a specific dietary regimen, O. Anytime we saw F with M, which is another dietary regimen, or F with N, which is, again, the 3rd dietary regimen, because picking 1 dietary regimen necessarily excludes all the rest from being used. If F requires a specific dietary regimen, we cannot see it with any other dietary regimen. So yeah, same thing with V here. V requires M as its dietary regimen. Anytime we see V with anything other than M from the dietary regimen group, that's unacceptable. That's not going to work. So for us, that gets rid of both C and D, which is kind of handy here. But again, the point of this sort of demonstration / lesson being about what happens when you miss key insights like that. Yeah, we'll test answer choice D here real quick. So D suggests that we're using the letters O and V. So again, in case you missed the last insight that we had about V plus any diet other than M, you would end up analyzing D as well. So to cut down on the video's runtime, I'm not going to do the entire analysis here. So suffice it to say, it would play out pretty much identically to what we just did for C, and you just kind of build things up slowly as you work your way down to Rule 6. And once you reach Rule 6, you'd realize that, hey, we have V on board, but as we're using O now, O prevents us from using M as Rule 6 demands. You would end up eliminating it basically for the exact same reason that you would have eliminated C. Which of course just leaves us alone with answer choice E, which suggests that you could use the letters V and W alongside of G. And I would like to make one thing exceedingly clear. Given the volume of work and how methodical we've been, I'd feel perfectly fine just picking E and not even testing it one bit. But again, for the sake of demonstration, we can kind of go through the motions here. So as we always do, just going to plug the information from the stem and our answer choice directly into a diagram, see what we have and see where we need to go. So when we plug all that information in, we get this. We have one unspecified dietary regimen that we need to fill out. It looks like we have G as at least one of our antibiotics, and then V and W as our potentially two, maybe even three total physical therapies. So we've got 4 out of the 5 that we need total to finish this out. What do we have left to reach a full 5 treatment? So again, starting with rule number 1, rule 1 tells us that we have at most 2 antibiotics. Rule 2 tells us that we have only 1 dietary regimen and no more than that. So these are our options as follows. So we can have 1 more antibiotic, which would cap us out at our maximum of 2, and it would look like this. 1 dietary regimen, 2 antibiotics, one of which is G, and then just 2 physical therapies with no additional one, and that's filled out by V and W. So that's one option. The other option is to add no more antibiotics and then to only add 1 more physical therapy regimen. So that would leave us with, again, our single dietary regimen. This time G is alone as our 1 antibiotic, and then we would add 1 more physical therapy to our 2 that already exist, so that would leave us with a blank and V and a W. And so even though it hasn't really panned out so far, I am going to start with the 0 additional antibiotics and 1 additional physical therapy option, because again, the certainty. We know exactly what's going to go into that last physical therapy slot, and it's U, because there are only 3 physical therapies total. They are U, V, and W, so if we're using all 3, we're literally using all 3, U, V, and W. And of course that would look something like this. And let's of course do the rules as quickly as possible, as we always do. Rule number 1 already accounted for. We only have 1 antibiotic, so we can't possibly violate this rule. Rule 2 is also accounted for. We don't know which one it is, but we only have 1 antibiotic slot, or excuse me, 1 dietary regimen slot available, so this is already accounted for as well. Rule 3 is also accounted for. We can't use O, and so Rule 3 of course is about the usage of F requires the usage of O. But yeah, I mean that's fine because we don't have room to include F anyways. Rule 4 is similarly accounted for. We are using W, but that's fine because we don't have room to include F anyways, so just like Rule 3, taken care of. And now onto Rule 5. This prevents us from using N in our dietary regimen slot. So now we only have M and O to use for our 1 single diet. And again, in case you've lost track of it, Rule 5 tells us that whenever G appears, we cannot have both N and U, so that's why we can't use N in our dietary slot, because we already have U on the board. So we're stuck with M and O. And of course, this sounds familiar, Rule 6 presents a problem. As we've seen elsewhere, using V requires us to also use H and M. So in our diagram, we do have room to throw in M as our 1 single dietary regimen, but there is no room for H. It looks like the 0 additional antibiotics, 1 additional physical therapy is a bust, so we'll be moving on to the 1 antibiotic and 0 additional physical therapies option. So again, the 1 additional antibiotic and 0 additional physical therapies possibility looks as follows. We, as always, have our single undetermined, as of yet, dietary regimen. But because we have 1 additional antibiotic, in addition to G, it's going to be G and a blank. And of course, G being provided to us from the question stem itself. And finally, when it comes to the 2 physical therapies, we're done there. Without adding an additional one, all we have are the 2 letters V and W that come from the answer choice itself. So now we just have 2 slots left to fill in the following fashion. Now the smart approach here would be to remember that the previous breakdown that we had tried, the 0 additional antibiotics and 1 additional physical therapy, the one that we just did, that just failed for us because of how Rule 6 and the entity V interacted. So again, remember having V forces us to use H and M. And since in this answer choice we still have V around, let's just throw in H as the remaining antibiotic and M as the sole dietary regimen, because we have to do that anyway. So now checking this possibility, which is complete against all the all the rules. Rule number 1, we're all good there. We have 2 antibiotics and that's it. Moving into rule 2, we are still all good here. M is our sole dietary regimen, so we're all good there. Rule 3 is also fine. There's O and F are both not anywhere to be found, so it doesn't matter. Similarly, rule 4, again, we do have W, but F is nowhere in sight, so this rule isn't invoked. Rule 5 is also fine. We have G present, but neither N nor U are there, so we have really no problems with this. And finally, we come to the infamous rule 6, and that was pretty much literally the first thing that we took care of, so yeah, we have V and we also have H and M. No surprise, we intentionally did at the beginning. I want you to note, though, if you hadn't really come up with that inference the first time through, none of the other rules really mandated that we do anything right. So you'd have kept your picture pretty much blank as it was, blank G, blank VW, until you got down to rule 6. And then you would have had to insert H and M according to rule 6. It would have played out the same way. I'm just trying to do my best here to show you both approaches and the superiority of kind of knowing ahead of time what you need to do. But still, even if you had missed that and had to brute force your way all the way down the list, you still would have gotten the exact same result. So of course, just having cleared this whole possibility that we just tried with every single rule and found out that it's good, we select E. I do want to note that you could have just as easily started off testing this one instead of starting off with the one that I did. There's really no particular reason not to have done that. I simply just defaulted to trying the 0 additional antibiotics, 1 additional physical therapy first, because of the certainty with which I had to use the entity U in that situation. There's really no other reason. It's mostly for consistency and demonstrative purposes that I picked it. So I do want to note here that the 0 additional antibiotics and 1 additional physical therapy, the thing that we did on the previous slide, it wasn't a completely wasted effort if you were paying attention, simply because if you did it right, it served as a stark reminder of Rule 6 and the limits of using the entity V. And also, even if you didn't end up doing the let's insert H and M right away insight that I started off with on this slide, the approach would have been identical if you just started with this blank picture, blank G, blank VW, and then went right down the list of rules. You just simply would have been forced to insert H and M when you reached Rule 6, but the result would have been exactly the same. So having gotten through all that, let's just push into 22, which is a pretty simple could-be-true situation. So as such, I'm just going to plug them in and see if they work. And we're going to go until we find one that works. A starts us off with F, M, and U. So as we always do, I'm just going to put the dietary regimen first because that's the one thing that is kind of easiest to work with. We have 1, that's M, and we have F representing at least one of our antibiotics, and U representing at least one of our physical therapies. So what do we have left to reach the mandated 5 treatments? So Rule 1 establishes that we have at max of 1 more antibiotic, and Rule 2, as we've seen so many times before, tells us that we can't use any more dietary regimens because we're already using M and we're only allowed to use exactly 1. So that leaves the possibility of adding just 1 more antibiotic and 1 more physical therapy to have something that looks like this, or no more antibiotics and then 2 more physical therapies, which would look like this. So all of this procedure should be mind-numbingly familiar to you at this point. And so again, I'm going to make what is probably going to be a bad call, and I'm going to start with the 0 additional antibiotics and 2 additional physical therapies. Because again, I know that V and W have to go into the 2 additional physical therapy slots. So again, it's all about the certainty, it's all about knowing and not having to guess. So, and maybe we'll get something useful out of it, maybe we won't. Either way, this is what it's going to look like, and we have a complete diagram at this point. So again, going down our list of rules, Rule 1, we're all good there. Rule 2, likewise, we're all good there. Rule 3, though, does present us a problem. This possibility that we have cannot use O because M is taking up our 1 slot available that we have to the dietary M and O group. But it does use F. So because we have F, we do require O, but we have no room for O. So this is a problem. So as we've seen before, 0 additional antibiotics, 2 additional physical therapies, that breakdown is a bust. So we now are going to move on to the 1 additional antibiotic and 1 additional physical therapy possibility. But do we really have to test another one? The 1 antibiotic, 1 physical therapy variant also uses M, and that's going to have the exact same problem. There's no way for us to include O because M is already taking the sole slot available to dietary regimens. And our answer includes F, which requires us to use O, but at the same time it uses M, which disqualifies us from ever using O. So one element of the answer requires the use of O, another element of the answer bans the use of O. This is a problem. So, in fact, as we have just discussed, you should probably see at this point that F, in addition to any diet other than O, is going to be no good, so we get to eliminate answer choice A. So starting right up with answer choice B now, FOW, let's see if this works. So as usual, we plug it in, O as our sole dietary regimen, F as one of our antibiotics, W as one of our physical therapies, but we don't know what's left. What do we have left to reach the mandated 5, as always? Well, Rule 1 tells us that, again, as always, we have maximum one more antibiotic on top of F, and Rule 2 again tells us that we can't use any more dietary regimens because we're already using O and we're only allowed to use one. So that we can use one more antibiotic and one more physical therapy to get a total of 5 that would look like this. Or we could go with no more antibiotics and then instead 2 more physical therapies, and that would look something like this. And so, as I have done unsuccessfully for the past few times, I will start with the option that gives me the most certainty. So starting with 0 extra antibiotics and 2 extra physical therapies, because the certainty of using U and V to fill in those last 2 spots. So again, if we end up using all 3 physical therapies, I know exactly which 3 physical therapies they are, just all of them, U, V, and W. So putting that into that possibility, we get this. And as usual, check it against all the rules. Rule number 1, we're all good there. We're only using 1 antibiotic, and that's F. Rule 2, we are using exactly 1 dietary regimen, and that is O. Rule 3, we are all good here because we are using an F, but we are using an O that is required by F, so it's a nice change of pace compared to what we just saw in A. But we do run into a problem with Rule 4. We can't use F whenever we use W, but the answer choice itself is trying to use F and W at the same time. And again, I want to note, we could and should have seen this immediately upon reading the answer choice itself, having some cognizance of the rules, because we've seen them so many times. Hopefully you would have picked up on this, and kudos to you if you did. That's the way I would say that this is supposed to be eliminated. But hey, remember the point of this whole thing, even without any insights or deductions, so long as you follow all the rules, you will end up getting and reaching the info that you need. So again, I pointedly did not mention the whole conflict between W and F that's hard-coded into this answer choice on its face. It should have been apparent to you if you had seen Rule 4 any number of times and remembered that W and F are kind of a forbidden pair. An answer that suggests that you use them at the same time is obviously not what you're looking for, and that could have saved you all this work. That's true. But again, the point here is to demonstrate that even if you are missing key insights like that, it doesn't take you that long, you don't have to work that hard, and perhaps most importantly, just working consistently will get you those insights. They will get you that information. Just the ideal thing is that once you have sort of done brute force to uncover that information, once you've found something, then actually hold on to it. Write it down if you have to, make reference to it, incorporate that into the next answer choice, the next question that you test, and that's how you benefit from this sort of thing. A final note for answer choice B on question 22 is by this point you're probably noticing that my choice to go for the higher certainty, I know exactly how to fill out the last 2 physical therapy slots, that gamble has never paid off. Even if you can't articulate exactly why it is, and I still to this day can't really, I probably could find some rule-based way to justify it, but I've never bothered. Even if you can't say exactly why that's never worked, it's fair game to notice the pattern like maybe 2-ish questions ago and stop going for it first. That's a perfectly fine approach. Again, I think I'm just going to stick with it for as long as I can here for demonstrative purposes, but for you, for actually doing this exam, it would have been fair game to have abandoned this method a long time ago. So at any rate, we are going to eliminate B because of Rule 4. Pushing into C, which suggests that we might be able to use the letters G, N, and V. Same old, same old. We're going to throw it into our diagram, N as leading the way as our one single solitary dietary regimen, and that group is done. G again as one of however many antibiotics that are possible. And then V is, of course, just one of many possible antibiotic combinations that we have. So we have 3. What do we need to reach the mandated 5? And again, we start with rule number 1 that tells us that we have at maximum 1 more antibiotic, and Rule 2 tells us that, again, as we've seen consistently, we cannot use any more dietary regimens. So to get the extra numbers, that only leaves the possibility of using 1 more antibiotic and 1 more physical therapy to get a full set of 5. Or we use 0 more antibiotics and then 2 more physical therapies to reach our full set of 5. And so again, even though it's failed pretty much every single time, just for consistency's sake and for demonstrative purposes, I will be starting with 0 antibiotics and 2 physical therapies, because again the certainty of using U and W to fill it out. So that was, what we have below NG, V, U, W is what our insertion would look like here. So as we do, we can check it against the rules. Rule number 1, we're all good. G is the sole antibiotic we're using. We're not in violation of 1. Rule 2, again, is all good. We only have one dietary regimen, that's N. We're also clear on Rule 3. There's no O and there's no F, so it doesn't really matter. Rule 4, we're also clear on, because we do have a W, but we do not have an F, so we're all good there. Rule 5, though, we do run into a problem. So if we are using both G and N, as this answer choice forces us to, we cannot use U. But as we see here, the 0 additional antibiotics and 2 additional physical therapies requires us to include U. And that specifically is because it uses 3 physical therapies, and there's only one way to do that, is to use U, V, and W, so U is included. So again, 0 antibiotics and 2 physical therapies is a bust, as we've seen so many times before. Every time we are trying to use all 3 physical therapies, we do seem to run into quite a few problems. So at this point, we move on to the 1 additional antibiotic and 1 physical therapy possibility. So moving on to this possibility, which looks as follows. Rule number 1 is already accounted for. We have 2 slots available for antibiotics, and that's the maximum, so we're still okay here. Rule 2, again, we're all good. We only have 1 dietary regimen, that's N. Rule 3 does give us some more information to work with. Having N as our sole dietary regimen prevents us from using O, which is also a dietary regimen, which in turn prevents us from using F. So that tells us that we now have to use H as the remaining antibiotics. So our only option to put as the extra antibiotics H, because again, working backwards, we're already using G. If we were to try to add F, we would need to have O, but we can't have O because N is already there. Moving along forward now to Rule 4, it's all good. It does leave us eligible to use W, since we just found out in Rule 3 that we can't use F. So we're still okay here. Rule 5 works very similarly to Rule 3. It prevents us from using U, since we already have G and N on the board, and those 2 are required by the answer choice that we're testing. So there's no negotiation there. We have to use both of those. So that means we cannot use W. So the only letter remaining that we have to slot into our final physical therapy slot is W. And we just confirmed in Rule 4 that we are okay to use W, so let's just throw that in right here. And of course, though, Rule 6, by the time we get all the way to the bottom, it does present us with a problem. So using V as our answer choice forces us to use both H and M, but we have no room for N because this answer choice has already chosen N as our sole dietary regimen. So just a note here, how many times have we seen Rule 6 and the presence of V stop us cold? Because after the first few times, as soon as you see the letter V in a question or answer choice, you should start skipping right to Rule 6 and see if it matters, because we've seen this so many times. That would have saved us a lot of analytical work. So when all is said and done, since nothing we can try worked, we are going to eliminate C. We tested both possibilities, neither of them had any viable way out, so that's an elimination right there. So we are moving along to option D, which proposes that G, V, and W are what might be able to work here. As we are wont to do, we are just going to plug G, V, W right into our diagram and see where we need to go from there to reach the mandated 5. So as always, Rule 1 tells us that at most we can have 1 more antibiotic to get from 4 of these to 5, and Rule 2, of course, as always, has been telling us that we cannot use any more dietary regimens than the one that we've kind of made room for here. So that leaves us only the following options. We can either reach the 5 treatments by adding 1 more antibiotic and no more physical therapies, which would look like this, or we could add no more antibiotics and instead add just 1 more physical therapy to reach a full 5, like so. So I am, again, just for consistency's sake, going to start with 0 more antibiotics and 1 more physical therapy because of the whole I know I have to use U thing. I am sick of being wrong too. I'm probably going to be wrong here again, but we'll see what happens. So starting with Rule 1, this is all good. We are only using 1 antibiotic here, so we cannot possibly violate this. Rule 2 is already accounted for because we haven't filled it in yet, but we have just budgeted 1 spot for antibiotics, so this is kind of taken care of. Rule 3 also seems fine. Since we can't use F anywheres because this breakdown only uses G as the sole antibiotic, O's presence or absence loses all of its impact, so Rule 3 is fine. Rule 4 also seems fine. We couldn't use F anyways, just as we found out in Rule 3, so the presence of W isn't going to be a problem for us here. So Rule 5 does add a little bit more to our picture. The effect of Rule 5 is that we are going to be prevented from using N as our dietary regimen, because this answer choice already mandates the use of G, and the breakdown we are testing mandates the use of U. So for dietary regimens, we are down to M and O as our only remaining choices. And you guys probably saw this coming a mile away at this point, but by the time we reach Rule 6, we do have another problem. So the presence of V, which is part of the answer choice that we're testing, so it has to be here for us, That forces us in Rule 6 to use both H and M we have room for. But there is no room for H in this breakdown, so that does present us a problem. And really, I need to make a note here. How many times have we seen R6 stop us dead cold at this point? People, I cannot stress enough how much work savings you can get out of developing a sensitivity to rule interactions as you go along. Just in this video alone, I don't know how many times I've mentioned Rule 6. It's come up almost every single time. So I want to emphasize here is that because we've seen Rule 6 do this so many times during testing, even if you couldn't see how important Rule 6 was going to be up front, and arguably you could have, just by the fact that, and I did mention it, that the presence of V kind of touches both other categories, and that's pretty unique to the rules. But even if you couldn't make that inference right up front, almost every single question let us get to Rule 6 and then stopped us there. So by the first few questions, it should have become apparent, even if you missed it up front, that this rule is going to be very significant. And as we found out pretty much every time we've tried it, the 0 antibiotic, 1 physical therapy thing is a bust, so we are moving on to 1 antibiotic and 0 physical therapies added. Alright, so now that we're moving on to the 1 additional antibiotic and 0 additional physical therapies, that possibility, when we plug in the answer choice, looks like this. So moving right into the rules, Rule 1, as usual, it's all good. We have budgeted 2 spaces for an antibiotic, or 4 antibiotics, so we are still within the purview of this rule. Rule 2 has already been accounted for. We don't know what's going to go in there, but we have budgeted just 1 spot for this one. Rule 3 also seems fine. We can use the O and F combination if need be at this point in our rules analysis if we wanted to. But Rule 4 tells us to never mind on the OF combination, because this answer choice mandates the use of W as a physical therapy. That means that F is off the table. O can still be used if need be, but at least the OF combination that I mentioned in Rule 3 is not really going to appear in that form. As for Rule 5, this seems fine because we're not using U. If we wanted to put in the N, the G that is mandated by our answer choice is still safe. So we could still use U. Since we're not using U, we can still use N if we really wanted to as our dietary regimen. But by the time we get to Rule 6, our familiar friend Rule 6 forces us to insert H and M since the answer choice is forcing us to use V. So again, this rule tells us that whenever we're using V, which we are because that's part of answer choice D, whenever we're using V, we have to include H and M, and for once, we actually have room to include both H and M, so we may as well do that here. And at this point we have a complete diagram, and we also know this works because we've been careful to do 2 things. The first thing is that we've made sure our diagram allows us to incorporate each rule if need be along the way. And we've also refrained from filling in anything that we weren't totally sure about. If you want to, you can do a lightning check of all the rules against this filled in diagram that we have, HGMVW, and you'll get the same confirmation that we just went through in seconds. So pretty simple. We have finally found a possibility that works, so we select D as our answer. So even though we did just pick D, just for the sake of discussion, answer choice E gives us H, N, and V as our possibility. And I would really not advise checking E if you are brute forcing several questions along the way. But if you absolutely must, the process is going to be identical to everything that I've shown you so far. We always start with the same procedure. Start with what the answer choice gives you. And once you've put that into sort of a blank diagram, see what you can do to meet the exactly 5 treatments that are mandated by Rule 0. So it's these you have 3 here, you know that you need a total of 5. So how are you going to fill in the remaining 2 slots? That's the question. And then you come up with some breakdowns based on what we just discussed. How can you reach 5 from where you are? And you test each breakdown that likely results from being able to add 1 or 0 additional antibiotics. And to do that, you start at Rule 1 and just work your way down. And as we've seen, you're probably going to get all the way down to Rule 6 before you get stopped. And along the way, you can curse the LSAT for their deviousness as you eliminate yet another answer. It's all the same monotonous dribble. And for this particular choice, if you're cognizant of the rules, you can eliminate this one without even testing anything. Because you see that our familiar friend V is there. And it's using H, which is nice. But it's also using N as our sole dietary regimen, which means that we cannot use N. Because, again, N is taking the sole dietary regimen spot. That puts E on its face in violation of Rule 6 because, again, Rule 6 tells us V requires the use of H and M, but here we're using H and N, and that's not kosher. That doesn't work. So finally, we have reached the last question of this set, number 23. Which one can never be used, ever? So this is a must be false. So the smart approach here would be to look at all the completed diagrams that you've made so far, and based on that, you would eliminate any answer choices here that include a treatment that you have successfully used in the past. But yes, this can also be brute forced in case, for whatever reason, maybe you just skip to this question for whatever reason and you have no basis for it. And it will be a little bit less troublesome than the rest, so let's proceed. How would you do this question if you were starting from zero, basically? So again, as a very small reminder, so you can tell that this slide is going to be full of text. The question itself was, which one of the following can never be used ever? So again, it's a must be false. So starting right up with our first choice, A. A alleges that G can never be used. So all we have to do, according to the table of power, is to get G to work once in a diagram, and we get to eliminate A. So inserting G into a blank diagram, we have one empty slot for our mandated exactly one dietary regimen. G is going to be one of potentially 2 antibiotics that we use, and then the rest is kind of up in the air. Where do we go from here, as usual, to reach the full 5 treatments that are mandated by Rule 0? So starting, as we always do, with the rules to help guide us here. Rule 1, as always, has been telling us that at maximum we have 2 antibiotics. Rule 2, which we've kind of accounted for, tells us that at most we have 1 dietary regimen, and at least we have 1 dietary regimen, so there's always exactly 1. So we don't really get any more flexibility from there. So that leaves some familiar choices. Either we can add 1 more antibiotic and 2 more physical therapies to reach a full 5 slots. Or we can choose to go with no more antibiotics and instead 3 more physical therapies, and that would also get us to a full 5 slots. And so far, normally I would have started with the 0 additional antibiotics and all 3 physical therapies because of the UVW certainty thing, but I've had enough of this game and I'm tired of being wrong, so I'm actually going to just start with the first possibility, adding 1 more antibiotic and 2 more physical therapies, as follows here. So in this situation, Rule 1 is already accounted for. Again, we have budgeted for exactly 2 antibiotics, and that is within the bounds of this rule. Rule 2 is also one of the things that we accounted for very early on. We have exactly 1 slot budgeted for dietary regimens, which is exactly what this rule tells us we need to have. Now, Rule 3 tells us that we can still use the OF combination if need be, because we have a lot of open space here, and there's room for O to go into the dietary slot, and F to go into the remaining antibiotic slot if we really wanted it to. Rule 4 also leaves us a similar amount of flexibility. We just need to be careful to avoid using W and F at the same time. We haven't placed W because we haven't been forced to. We also haven't placed F, so this is still up in the air, so we haven't violated this one. We just need to be careful that in the future we don't. Rule 5 is going to operate very similarly. We need to be careful to avoid using N and U at the same time because we have G on the board, and that is something that our answer choice forces us to try here. So as long as we are careful about not slotting both of those at the same time, we haven't violated this one yet, but it's still possible that we might, so we just need to be careful. So this brings us to Rule 6, our familiar friend. Using V is quite limiting, as we've seen repeatedly, right? So remember from my previous LG lessons, that seems like that stuff was way in the past now because we've spent so long here in this particular game, but remember the giving yourself room to succeed principle. That is the principle that guides how you fill in hypothetical diagrams, where a rule doesn't force you to do stuff, but you need to start trying things that could be true rather than must be true. So normally this principle would make me avoid using V, but actually, because we've seen how often Rule 6 comes in at the end to ruin our day, ironically using V along with H and M, I would say, seems to increase the probability that we'll be safe from Rule 6. So I'm just actually going to try that here, hypothetically. I didn't know that this would work out the way it did, but we've seen V ruin our day so often. Maybe if we just account for it early on, that'll kind of take care of problems ahead of time. So we'll slide in a V here, which of course in turn, according to Rule 6, requires us to add H and M, and that's what this would look like. So we added a V, and because of that, we have to add M as our dietary regimen, and H as our second antibiotic. And according to our rules, I think we are free to use U or W at this point in the last slot, so we can just kind of double incorporate them here. Just checking this against the rules, it seems to work out. There's nothing against us using U. The only thing that would possibly hit us there is Rule 5, and we don't have N, so that's okay. And W, the only thing that would stop us from using W is if we were using F, and we are not using F here, so both of those would be okay to use. And so if you're still not satisfied, you can do another quick check against all the rest of the rules, but it shows that this works, so we can eliminate answer choice A pretty safely. So before plowing through and getting the rest of the answer choices, we just saw that this combination, MGHVU, worked for answer choice A. And we also know that MGHVW works as well, because remember the last thing that we talked about on the previous slide was that U and W were essentially interchangeable for testing answer choice A. And so at this point, it really bothers my conscience to recommend anything other than some fast eliminations to reduce the sheer amount of grind that are demonstrated. All of you probably got the idea several questions ago anyway. And so because we are allowed to now eliminate anything that is in a viable possibility, we can get rid of B, D, and E because we have used M, U, and W successfully. And so at this point you can select C without even testing it. If you're unsure, you can go back and look at your previous work just to confirm that you've never actually used N in a successful diagram. But I mean, really, I think we're all quite sick of this at this point. So I would say just select C without testing it. You've been thorough enough if you followed the procedure that I've laid out here. So yeah, this was a big oof. This hurt quite a bit. At least it felt that way to me. So takeaway number one: pure brute force all the way through is not advisable. It sucks terribly. It's just not recommended in any way, shape, or form. Takeaway number two, though: starting off the first 2 or 3 questions with brute force is okay, though, so long as you make sure to remain methodical and you pick up on repeat offenders like the entity V or Rule 6. Our final takeaway number 3: you can rely on brute force when you're missing key insights. It will always be there for you when all else fails. It is the nuclear option, though. So again, the role of brute force, to put it simply, is it's there as the ultimate fallback, and you can start with it. So not as a fallback, but you can actually start with it. But the point of starting with brute force is that it should lead you to all those insights that you may not have been able to pick up organically as you're doing the setup phase. The goal, again, with brute force is that not to just kind of take brute force all the way through. You can if you absolutely need to, but it's deeply inefficient. What you really want to do is use brute force and pick up insights along the way. And of course, that brings us to the end. Thanks, like and subscribe, do all that stuff, and I hope to see you guys in the next one.